Now, moving on to our main agenda, today we're thrilled to have with us Dr. Dinesh Joseph Wadiwel. Dinesh is an associate professor in human rights and social legal studies at the University of Sydney with a strong background in social and political theory. He's an expert in human-animal studies and disabilities rights and have worked extensively within civil societies organizations, particularly in anti-poverty and disability rights. His research spans across a wide range of subjects, including theories of violence, critical animal studies, and disability rights. So we're here today to talk about his latest book, Animals and Capital, which was published by Edinburgh University Press last year. In this book, Dinesh dives into the intersection of Marx value theory and animal labor within capitalist food systems. It's a groundbreaking work that challenges the way we think about human-animal relations under capitalism. So for this event, Dinesh has also very kindly adjusted his talk to cater to our audience, including how his approach differs from eco-Marxism, the conceptualization of animals' resistance, and his thoughts on animal advocacy in the global south. So before we get started with Dinesh's presentation, I want to just take a quick moment to appreciate Dinesh, who's joining us from Australia. Thank you so much, Dinesh, for making the time to be here with us today. And a big shout out to my friends at Shandong University for their support in organizing this event. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Dinesh.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jin, for organizing this. Apologies as well for the mix-up with the timing. I should say that Jin and I coordinated this when I was in Boston, and we got the timing slightly wrong, but thankfully I could be here. I'm going to share my slides, so just give me a minute. And hopefully you can all see that. So as Shin was saying, I'm going to talk a bit about my book, but I'm going to share just a few perspectives that might be more interesting for you. There's some time at the end to ask questions, but if there are things that come up and you'd like to talk about them, please feel free to interrupt me. I don't have a problem with that either. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about this new book that was released last year, Animals and Capital. And maybe to just tell you a bit about just the personal background behind this book. In 2015, I released a book called The War Against Animals. And in that book, I started to read Karl Marx's Capital. And that informed one of the chapters of that book, The War Against Animals. But as I was reading Capital, I was really struck by just how present animals were in the texts of Marx. And this was something I didn't expect. It was a bit of a surprise, though if we think about it, when Marx was writing in the 1800s, animals were an important, if you like, raw material of capitalism. So it is no surprise that we see animals everywhere. And animals are also an important form of labor under capitalism, or at least a driving force in terms of traction for capitalism. So we think about early capitalism, so we have production systems where animals such as horses are directly involved in providing traction or force for the development of capitalism. So in a sense, Marx is describing this scene that he sees before him. And that's partly why we see animals everywhere in Marx. So when I started reading this, I thought, well, maybe there's more to say about this relationship between animals and capital. And that's the origins of this book, which tries and do justice to that. And the book is largely about Marx, but of course, the overall focus is capitalism, and particularly the role of food animals used for food within capitalism. So I thought I'd just start with just some of the impulses behind the book. So the book is meant to be providing a theoretical examination of capitalism, but to really do so from the standpoint of animal advocacy. And what I mean by that animal advocacy is people who are interested in the rights interests and welfare of animals, to try and provide a perspective on capitalism that reflects those interests. As I'll talk about in a second, in a sense, I'm actually trying to offer a standpoint of the animal within capitalism. And so this is something I'll talk about in a minute when we think about how this book might be different from forms of eco-Marxism. The book aims to engage two different audiences. So the first audience would be something that I would put my scholarship within, which is animal studies or animal rights or animal liberation literature. So a lot of my work sits in that camp as animal studies. But the book also aims to engage Marxists and leftists, anti-capitalists. So I'm interested in those two different audiences. And in some ways, the goal of the book is to bring these two different audiences together. So one challenge we have, I would say, when we look at, say, the history of left and Marxist scholarship, is that by and large, it has neglected animals. They've neglected animals as a serious area of study or interest. And simultaneously, I'd say that animal rights theory, animal liberation theory has largely neglected capitalism and Marxism. Lots of the origins of animal rights theory in the modern sense come from liberal analytic philosophy. And there has been tended to be an isolation between liberal analytic philosophy and Marxism generally, but animal studies or animal rights philosophy and Marxism. So one aim of the book is to try and bring these two areas of theory together. And firstly, to get leftists and Marxists to think about animals, but also get animal rights people to be thinking about not just Marxist theory, but the problem of capitalism. How does capitalism relate to the kinds of situations that face animals today? An important part of the book, and it's something I'll again talk about in a second when we think about the relationship of the book to eco-Marxism, is that I want to center animals and animal agency within the story. An important question I ask, and it's one I'll get to in this talk, is, do animals have labor power? So labor power is an important question within Marxist theory. And typically within Marxist theory, the view is that what makes human and human work distinctive is the capacity to alienate labor power. So a question that my book asks is, do animals have that capacity too? And what does this mean for our reading of capitalism? There's also a broader question about the book that sits behind the book, which relates to the strategy of animal rights movements. So my interest, and perhaps your interest, is how do we make the world a better place for animals? And I share some deep concerns about the way that intensification in particular, the arrival of factory farming, what it has done to human-animal relations, and how it has made the lives of animals miserable. So the aim of the book is strategically to start challenging this. But one thing I'd note is that lots of the focus of animal rights movements is in relation to what I would call the politics of consumption. So much focus is upon convincing consumers to change their dietary practices. And what's often been neglected is the politics of production. How do we change systems of production to enable just outcomes? So the goal of the book is to try and, working within that orbit, to try and shift some of the discussion towards production. We're seeing this happen on a global level. So there has been more of an interest in food system change, an interest in cultivated meat and other products. This book is really interested in the structure of how we produce food and how this relates to how animals are treated, and how production drives consumption, which if you know Marx, you know this is a central question. One thing that I thought I'd just share is how this book might relate to the emerging fields of eco-Marxism and how it differs. So over the last 20 or 30 years, there have been several important texts that are broadly within the scope of ecological or green Marxism. Many of these texts have emerged at a point where capitalism is in an antagonistic relationship with the environment and nature, and all of us are very aware of this. So I would say an originally important text would be John Bellamy Foster's Marx's Ecology, where Bellamy Foster, as you might know, looks at Marx and looks at some of the writings of Marx and points out that Marx was very concerned about the ecology and saw an antagonism between capitalism and nature. And this moves against a kind of modernist or Promethean reading of Marx, which suggests that Marx was just simply had a view that human progress simply was just about using nature as an end towards human improvement. Against this, people like Bellamy Foster have made the argument that actually Marx was very aware of the environment and aware of the contradiction between the endless growth of capitalism and the environment. Since then, we've seen a number of, I think, really important texts that have worked in that space. So one is the more recent text by Jason Moore called Capitalism in the Web of Life. And in this book, Moore contests Foster to an extent, but puts forward a similar kind of view about capitalism creating a complete worldview that organizes both production and social life towards endless accumulation, and that in a sense, ending capitalism is key to challenging environmental devastation. We've also seen a recent book by Kohei Saito, the Japanese Marxist, Marx in the Anthropocene, which pushes, I think, Foster even further and sort of says, you know, the goal that Marx was seeking was a kind of communism that was actually a degrowth communism, was not premised upon endless economic growth. All these texts are really important, but one thing I'd note about all of them is that animals are not centered in any way within these texts. So animals are simply treated as part of nature, and part of a nature that is exploited by capitalism. One thing my book tries to do is to narrate this story of capitalism, but putting the animals as a central force or workforce within capitalism, and one that I think is worth paying attention to that is neglected within lots of eco-Marxism. So this is one difference between my book and some of these eco-Marxist texts. And in a sense, I'm using a method that we find present in Marx's Capital. One of the things that Marx does in Capital, in particular in the text, is offer two different standpoints of capitalism. One is at the beginning pages of Capital Volume 1, Marx offers a kind of bourgeois reading of capitalism, or capitalism as seen through the bourgeoisie, and then switches the reading, it's after chapter 6 of Capital, to providing the standpoint of capitalism from the viewpoint of the worker. In some ways, my book, Animals and Capital, just simply aims to provide a viewpoint of capitalism from the standpoint of animals. How is it that animals are distinctively leaped upon by capitalism and used in ways that, in my view, are quite unique and worth paying attention to? This means that I put forward a view that animals are their own workforce or labor force under capitalism, but one that is differentiated from the human labor force. So in a sense, one way to look at capitalism is that there are essentially at least two workforces. One is human and one is non-human. And the conditions for these two different workforces are quite different, and it's worth paying attention to both. The setting for the book is about the intensification of animal agriculture. So if we're going to look at the long-run tendency of capitalism and its relationship to food systems, it has been a continuing tendency towards intensification and the acceleration of production to enable the overproduction of food commodities for human consumption. If we look at the data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, since they've been keeping records, what we've seen is a dramatic per capita increase in animal-based food consumption globally. So what this means is not just that more and more animals are being used for food as human populations rise, it's that every year humans on a per capita basis eat more and more animal products. So this has led to an exponential rise in consumption. The only way that this sort of dramatic increase in consumption is possible is through obviously a massive expansion in production. And this has happened largely through forms of intensification. So when I say intensification, what I mean by that is the deployment of machines, of technologies, enclosures, and practices which reduce human labor time per unit of production and typically speed production. So in a sense, intensification, as the word is used, effectively is talking about the arrival of the factory, or in this case, the factory farm. So the moment that you introduce machines, technologies, enclosures, technological practices into a production process, you're effectively introducing factory techniques. And in the case of animal agriculture, you're basically creating the factory farm. Lots of the focus of global scholarship on factory farms has largely looked at land-based animal agriculture. So often I'd say, and this relates to something I'll talk about soon, lots of the focus has been on land-based animal agriculture in particularly North America and the United States. And lots of it's focused on, for example, chickens or pig production. These are, of course, really important sites of production, but they've also missed that other animals have been used have been subject to intensified production, but also other countries, particularly those in the Global South, have their own story around how animal agriculture has been intensified. An important area of intensification, I would say, has been aquaculture, and it's something that's often missed in scholarship. As of 2014, more than half of the seafood consumed by humans comes from aquaculture or fish factory farms. And this now seafood taken from aquaculture now exceeds beef production globally. So this is a huge growing area of production, and by nature, aquaculture is effectively intensive production. It's also interesting to note that against all of these readings of the factory farm as the prototype for the factory farm being in North America, it's actually other countries that have innovated in the case of aquaculture. And China is actually the world's number one aquaculture producer. So this is interesting as well, because in my research, I would say that what is happening in China in relation to aquaculture tells us about the future of animal agriculture generally. So let me just pause there to just share a bit of this story. So China has seen a dramatic increase in seafood production over the last 70 years. And the bulk of that has been in the space of aquaculture development. So China still is actively involved in wild fish capture on the seas and is one of the largest producers of wild caught fish. But China is the number one aquaculture country in terms of the absolute scale, but also in terms of how fast this has grown in China. So China is both supplying the domestic market in China, but also exporting globally its products that have come from aquaculture. Some of the ways in which aquaculture is developing in China are also completely innovative and of a scale that is unreplicated elsewhere in the world. So this is an image of a salmon farm called Deep Blue in the Yellow Sea. And this is a huge sea pen that I think holds, I think it's 500,000 fish, maybe it's 300,000 fish, I've forgotten the exact number. And this sea pen is quite sophisticated in that it can move up and down in the Yellow Sea to produce different temperature conditions for the sea, for the salmon below. So basically the whole facility moves up and down to create different conditions to enable the fish to live and then to die. In this case, this image shows a large tanker that arrives. Periodically, there's a vacuum tube where they suck the fish into the hull of the ship to be processed there. So to me, this is the largest aquaculture facility in the world, I believe, and this tells us the direction of, in my view, factory farming in the future. And this is an actual image of Deep Blue 1. My understanding is that China is currently building Deep Blue 2 and 3. So they're replicating this facility, which will be co-located in that area. That's my understanding about what is going on with Deep Blue. So how do we make sense of all of this, the factory farm, and what does it mean today? Well, the typical way that the factory farm has been understood in animal rights literature has been to say that this is a product of our so-called speciesism. So in this view, in the animal rights world, there's this view that we hold discriminatory attitudes towards animals, that we are anthropocentric, and this speciesism leads to a kind of discrimination where we subject other animals to all sorts of horrible things, abuses, because we don't see them as equal to us. The factory farm in this reading it's just an intensified form of speciesism. It's because we've misunderstood animals that we allow animals to be subject to this form of intensive exploitation. Here, in a sense, speciesism, or what I would describe instead with the phrase hierarchical anthropocentrism, is located as the cause of human violence towards animals. And this is what gives the force or the logic of the factory farm. But in my book, I pose the challenge that maybe speciesism is not the only reason that we are seeing what we're seeing when we look at animal agriculture. One reason is that if we think about it, the tendency of capitalism is towards intensification. And in some ways, and I'll talk about this, intensification reflects the experience of the development of the factory farm. So firstly, let's think about capitalism. Capitalism, firstly, has a tendency towards intensification. It's something that, by the way, was utterly predicted by Marx in Capital. So typically, because capitalism has a tendency to overproduce commodities in order to extract profits. And it does this by seeking to reduce human labor time and human labor time in order to extract more surplus through the production process. One way to do this is to speed production, and this is typically only possible by adding machines, enclosures, technologies, or fixed capital to production. So in a sense, what I've described is basically a Marxist approach to intensification. And Marx would describe this as the tendency of the technical composition of capitalism to change, and one that is driven by a general law of capitalist accumulation. So capitalism will seek to continually accumulate as a way to extract surplus, and there'll be a tendency for the technical composition of capitalism to change so that more fixed capital becomes present in production. In the typical Marxist story, machines arrive and do not labor. So only humans labor in the Marxist story, but the machines, in a sense, embody past human labor. So in Marx's view, past human labor is embedded in the machine. So humans had to make the machine. It contains all of that valuable labor. And then when the machine is used in production, it dispenses that past expended human labor into production. And as the machine wears down, this depletes this labor over time. So that's the Marxist explanation of the machine. This story also helps to keep in place the Marxist view that humans are the only ones who labor in production. So you have machines standing alongside humans. Humans add value directly to production. Machines, on the other hand, contain past labor that is progressively expended within production as the machine depletes or deteriorates. In this story, if we think about animal agriculture, for Marx, animals are not laborers at all. So in Capital, Marx puts forward a strong view that animals are, at least food animals, are only inputs to production or raw materials. Sometimes these animals can represent past human labor time. So an animal who is born and fed by a human might represent the labor of that human, but animals in Marx's story never represent labor. They're always a raw material to production. So if we think about what does this all mean for the factory farm, well, Marx would argue that in a sense, the factory farm is an example of this rising technical composition of capitalism or capital. So human labor time is made more efficient by adding fixed capital, machines, enclosures, technologies to production, and progressively less and less human labor time is required per unit of production. And Marxists would say, well, that's all that the factory farm is. It's the arrival of fixed capital, the reduction of per unit human labor time, and the expansion of raw materials, i.e. animals, who become more and more products. These products are worked on by the production process and change from a raw material to a consumption commodity at the end of the process. In some respects, some green Marxists who I mentioned, John Bellamy Foster or Jason Moore, have told us that, in a sense, this story helps us with understanding the relationship of capitalism to the environment. And this is because of the tendency of capitalism to overproduce commodities, and also the tendency of capitalism to exploit natural resources to make money, that, in a sense, everything we need to know about the factory farm is contained within this Marxist story. That is, capitalism leaps upon animals as raw materials, as nature. It hyper-exploits them and it produces a bunch of commodities. One thing I'd say about all of these stories is that none of them have taken labor by animals seriously. And this is something that my book tries to address. What does it mean to say that maybe animals' labor in this process. So let's start by thinking about what is it that I'm saying with this book in terms of how does it amend or change some of these stories that have been put forward about capitalism. Well, one thing I'd say is that if we're going to understand the factory farm, we can't just simply say this is about speciesism or what I would call hierarchical anthropocentrism. Nor can we say it's just about capitalism. Actually, the argument I make in the book is that these two structural forces come together in the factory farm. The factory farm is both a result of a prevailing or prominent way in which many humans view animals as inferior, as beings who can be infinitely exploited. And simultaneously, it is a story about the capitalist production process merging with this hierarchical anthropocentrism to produce what I would argue is basically a living hell for animals. So in a way, the book makes the argument that we need to understand these two forces as working together. While traditional views of capitalism by Marxists would say that human labor has a distinct role under capitalism, my book makes the argument that animal labor is a problem and needs to be also understood. In my argument, the neglect of Marxism to deal with animal labor actually represents partly the anthropocentrism of Marx. So Marx, in his own analysis, was very clear that only humans labor and took extraordinary steps to deny the fact or to disapprove of the fact that animals may labor. So some people may know that in Capital Volume 2, Marx takes Adam Smith to task. So he critiques Adam Smith because in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith makes some suggestive comments that maybe animals labor. And in Capital Volume 2, Marx expresses his skepticism. He critiques Adam Smith to say, well, very clearly only humans labor. So again, I would argue this anthropocentrism is present within Marx, but it probably has continued with Marxist theory, this tradition of ignoring the specific place of animals, and as a result has maybe missed something that is useful to understand about capitalism. One thing I'd say is that the reason that I think it's important to overcome this anthropocentrism isn't just because we might want to address our own species narcissism, if you like. It's also that it produces a more complete analysis of capitalism. The more that we can understand the way that capitalism deals with different beings, but maybe also leaps upon the labor of different beings, the more that we can more fully understand how does capitalism work? What is the driving force behind capitalism? My book, in a sense, tests the idea that maybe Marx's labor value theory can be applied to animals. And overall, the book makes the argument that capitalism has leapt upon animals and hyper-exploited them, not just because animals are good to eat, but because they produce value. In fact, it is because they produce value, this helps to make sense of why it is that this mass exploitation of animals has occurred under capitalism. So let's now turn to think about animal labor and the argument I make in the book about this, and why I think it is useful to think about animal labor as a separate category and one that helps us to make sense of the factory farm. So as I mentioned, Marxist accounts typically only assume that animals are raw materials. So in these stories, humans labor, everything else that enters production is just simply a raw material that will become a consumption commodity or commodity at the end. A bunch of recent theorists, myself included, have been arguing that maybe animals labor in value producing ways. We haven't made this argument lightly, and have lent upon emerging labor value theory or interpretations of labor theory that usefully explain the ways that bodies are involved in production processes. A really important strand of this analysis for me has been feminist labor theories that look at the way that the body is used within production processes. And I was particularly influenced by work on commercial surrogacy, and particularly the work of Amrita Panda. So Panda wrote a book called Wombs in Labor, where she looked at commercial surrogacy in India. So this is the case of people who have a gestational capacity to produce children, who perform this labor for profit or for money. And Panda argues that this, in a sense, if we look at commercial surrogacy and the fact that somebody could become impregnated, carry and grow a being inside their body who'll be born and given to somebody else in exchange for money, tells us about the ways that capitalism can seize upon the metabolic or biological processes of the body and turn them into value-producing activities. So in the case of commercial surrogacy, literally those people involved, including women who are involved in this surrogacy, are giving birth for money. They're literally turning their gestational capacity into a surplus producing activity. Note as well that this tallies with core Marxist ideas about the labor production process under capitalism, including the theory of alienation. Like the theory of alienation would say that the worker doesn't have any proprietary interest in the product that is produced by their labor. And you only need to look at commercial surrogacy to see this is true, that those who give birth to children lose the right to have those children, right? So in a sense, they don't own the product of their labor. In these models, what I found interesting is that the metabolic work of the body is captured wholly or subsumed by the capitalist production process. And these become, in my view, very useful for understanding the labor of animals within food systems. So one question that's often asked about this labor is to say, well, if we think about a pig in an enclosure who's just being fed all day, is this labor? They're just being fed all day, they're not doing any work. What some of this feminist labor theory tells us is that, no, the point of productive labor for Marx was, does the activity produce surplus? And if it is positioned to produce surplus, then it is productive activity under capitalism. And in these cases, maybe the labor of animals could be potentially value producing in the same way if we take the view that this sort of metabolic labor, when situated within a productive process, can produce value. This is a long, horrible quote from Marx, which I won't read, but it tells us a bit about how Marx saw the production process. And so what I'd say in summary about this particular quote, again, I won't read it, but I'm happy to make my slides available, is that for Marx, there's in a production process, there's a fairly predictable set of events that happens. A raw material arrives at production. It is worked upon by human labor, sometimes with forms of fixed capital like a hammer. And through this process of applying labor to the raw material, a new product is produced. So a new commodity is produced at the end of the product. And Marx is also saying that something happens to value through this process. The raw material arrives with a particular value. The human labor adds new value, and this transforms the old value, which is maintained, into something that is completely new, is something with a new use value. So this is in a sense the philosophy of production that Marx describes in Capital Volume 1. But it also tells us something about the production process, that there is a raw material, there's labor, there's fixed capital in the form of, say, a machine or a hammer or tools, and there's a final product. And it's the combination of these things that produces the final product. We could describe this with the very simple formula. Like this is just a very simple schematic of how production might happen. And in this slide, I've just basically said the product is the combination of fixed capital, the technology or a tool, circulating capital, which is the raw material that is worked upon, and labor time. So in this case, human labor time, the time that is taken to produce something. So we think about something like making a table. There might be a hammer, and there might be a human who hammers together the table. And then there'll be circulating capital or raw materials that are used that are worked upon by the human with the tools, which produces a product at the end. So at the end, it's the combination of all those things that creates the product. Now, the reason I want to share this is that this is a useful way to start breaking down how animal labor time might fit into an animal agriculture production system. So let's think about how this might work. Let's think about an animal agriculture system where we have to insert both human labor time and animal labor time, and also animals as circulating capital within this system. So here I've come up with one way to represent this. So here the product equals fixed capital, such as, in the case of animal agriculture, a shed or an enclosure. It also includes animal circulating capital, the bodies of the animals, right, that are going through. Other forms of circulating capital, such as the feed or the pharmaceuticals that are given to the animals. It also includes the labor time of the humans and the labor time of the animals. So I'm going to include all of this in this formula. So this formula, in a way, represents what I would describe as the core elements of animal agriculture, where you include animals and animal labor time as discrete factors of or contributors to production. Okay, so let's try and make sense of, well, how would this work how does it tell us something new or interesting? Well, let's start by thinking about a simple animal agriculture system. So let's think about a form of production where it's just a shepherd who's grazing animals, working with grazing animals on a pasture, and the pasture is commonly owned. So this is typical of still many animal agriculture systems globally, though this sort of animal agriculture is disappearing. So the idea that there are pastures that are commons, that has disappeared from lots of animal agriculture systems. And we also typically are seeing the intensification of animal agriculture. So we're seeing factory farm style conditions replace it. But in certain parts of the world, you still have these forms of animal agriculture where there isn't a lot of fixed capital available. So in this system, where let's imagine there's a pasture, there's a shepherd, and there's some sheep, what we have is circulating capital, which is the food that is given to the animals. And this might be literally the pasture that is available to them. You have animals as raw materials. You have human labor time, and you have animal labor time. In this story, I've completely removed fixed capital. So there's no enclosures, there's no machines, it's just the shepherd, the pasture, the sheep. The reason I find this interesting is that it tells us something about the human-animal relationship that is going on in this production system. In this system, human labor time is required to manage almost every aspect of human life, of animal life. Humans are required to direct and guide sheep and enclose them, to sometimes protect them, but also to prevent them from escaping. Humans are involved in forms of branding and other horn cutting and other forms of body modification that aim to enable the product to realize a market eventually. In this system, the relationship between humans and animals is largely antagonistic, in the sense that humans are there to dominate the animals to produce a final product. So again, you might disagree with me and say these are beautiful systems where humans and animals get along. And there's certainly a romanticism about these systems. But my argument would be to say, if you look at the relationships of power, the aim of the human is to use these animals for an end product. So there's a relationship of domination there, and it's one that's largely antagonistic. In this system, animals have to graze to grow, and at a certain point, they will become the commodity. So their labor time is equivalent to the time that they spend living, and this will, as we'll see, is essential to animal agriculture. But also, the role of the human is to guide this whole process, and they do this without technology involved. And this is what produces the product at the end. And eventually, this shepherd will march these animals to the slaughterhouse, and that will be the end of their life. But let's think about I'm sorry, this is just the slide that explains all of what I've just said. Let's think about the opposite side of this system, where we have a factory farm style production system. So in a factory farm production system, you've got lots of fixed capital present. So you have enclosures, you have machines, you have technological processes everywhere. So some of the more modern forms of animal agriculture are actively using AI and Internet of Things and all sorts of things to speed production. You have lots of animals being pushed through production processes, born into production and dying in production. And you have lots of circulating capital. So lots of feed, pharmaceuticals going into this system so that lots of product can be produced. You still have animal labor time, i.e. the time that the animal is alive, metabolizing their own body to become an end product. But notice in this system, I've completely removed human labor time. This is a little bit fictitious in that most factory farms still include human labor time. But some forms of production almost completely remove humans from the production process. So we saw one example when I showed you the picture of Deep Blue, the Chinese aquaculture facility in the Yellow Sea, where actually, if you look at that facility, largely on a day-to-day basis, humans are completely absent. So human labor time is being completely removed. And this formula kind of comes close to describing what is going on for those animals. We also have seen the development of robotic dairy farms and other forms of automated factory farm facilities, which reveal this tendency, I would say, for the removal of human labor time from production, or at least the minimization of this labor time. If we think about what this all means, and the reason why I think focusing on animal labor time is important is that it starts to tell us some of the unique trajectories that we see within the factory farm that haven't been accounted for in Marxist theory because of this neglect of animals. So let's think about one of some of these implications. One is that if we take seriously that animals labor, then you might ask, well, what happens, or how's labor time treated by capitalism, and how does capitalism seek to reduce that labor time? So remember that a fundamental story with intensification of production is that capitalism has this drive to reduce human labor time as a way to extract surplus, and to also introduce forms of machinery into production to help increase the productivity of labor. But if we think about animal labor time, there's a few perversities with this. Because animals enter production as both a raw material and labor, they cannot be removed. In fact, we see the opposite tendency, because as production intensifies, more and more animal lives are used to create more and more products. And this means that the mass of animal labor time has to increase because there's a mass of animals in production. So how do you replace this labor time? You can't replace it with machines because you can't eat machines, right? Well, in my view, actually recognizing that animals labor helps to understand how capitalism deals with this problem, because capitalism has come up with some very specific and distinct ways to make animal labor time more efficient. One way has been to reduce the life of the animal. So one thing, as I noted, is that the labor time of the animal is equivalent to how long they live. If you think about metabolic labor time, and this is true of commercial surrogacy too, it's not confined by what we would describe as the working day. So under most human labor systems, the working day determines the length of time in a given day that humans can be subject to work or to have to give up their labor. And sometimes efficiencies in production come about by either making humans be more productive over the period of the working day, or sometimes by expanding the working day to extract more surplus. If you think about metabolic labor, on the other hand, the time that animals are laboring using their own bodily processes is through their whole life. So there is no working day. Actually, the whole point of capitalism of capitalist food production is that it captures the entire life of the animal and then tries to extract from this process as much value as it can. Well, one way that it's done this is to shorten lives. So we see this particularly in chicken production. Typically a chicken, a wild chicken will live up to 15 years. But what we're seeing in chicken production globally has been that today the typical chicken lives for 55 days before they're killed. And there are pushes to increase or reduce the lifespan of this chicken to 38 days. So in my view, actually, it can be this process of reducing animal lives can be usefully described as a process of making animal labor time more efficient. To me, this actually is a very useful way to describe exactly what capitalism is trying to do, which is to maximize the value that can be extracted from that life during the production process. Another interrelated drive has been to increase the yield of animal agriculture over the distinct period of time. So again, if we think about it, the way that human labor time might be made more efficient is, as I described, making humans produce more over the same period of time. Well, this has happened to animals, but this has happened through yield, i.e. by increasing the saleable body weight of the animal over the same period of time in which they're alive. And over the last 50 years, there've been substantial research and also substantial innovation to work on so-called feed conversion ratios to increase the yield that is available from chickens and pigs and other beings to make their labor time more efficient. So in a sense, actually, the reason why I want to share this is that a concept of animal labor time is very useful in trying to explain these processes in making the labor of animals more efficient, and one that isn't directly explainable by just focusing on humans. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that it also tells us something about the tendency of animal agriculture towards increased use of fixed capital. So as we know, capitalism tends to intensify by increasing the presence of fixed capital, machines, enclosures, technologies. And these often work by replacing human labor. So these supplant human labor in these production processes. What I think is interesting about animal agriculture is that we notice something very distinct. Human labor time disappears. Machines, enclosures, technologies, or fixed capital escalate, and so do animal lives. Animals also escalate, and we see this expansion of both fixed capital and animal lives, and a relative diminishment of human labor time. There's also a different relationship going on between machines and animal labor time versus human labor time. If we think about the relationship of human labor time to machines, it's one of competition. So this is a quote from Marx's Capital, towards the end of Capital, where Marx talks about the relationship of machines to human labor. So Marx says, and I quote, "Since machinery is continually seizing on new fields of production, its temporary effect is really permanent. Hence the character of independence from and estrangement towards the worker, which the capitalist mode of production gives the conditions of labor and the product of labor, develops into a complete and total antagonism with the advent of machinery." And one reason that this antagonism is there is that when machines arrive within capitalist production, typically they supplant human labor time. So the machine is there to make human labor time more efficient, and it typically does this by replacing human labor. We're seeing this playing out today with the discussions about artificial intelligence. Often these discussions are framed in relation to how will artificial intelligence replace human labor time. But if we look at the relationship of animals to fixed capital, we see something actually completely different. As fixed capital arrives, animal lives and animal labor simultaneously increases. Actually, fixed capital enables animal labor time and animal labor to increase. So we see this different relationship where machines sit side by side with animals. It's a relationship of antagonism, but not of replacement. Actually, often the machines are there to do the dominating that the humans didn't do before. So we think about an enclosure. There's images here on your screen of this horrific system of enclosures in a factory farm facility. Typically, the enclosure is there to do what humans previously did, which is to, in a pasture, prevent animals from escaping. The enclosure is there to replace human labor time. So here, the machine is present, but as an agent of direct domination, and it replaces human labor time in this purpose. Here, I think it's important to note the important relationship of resistance to animal resistance to animal agriculture. If we think about this story that Marx describes, so in this section of Capital where Marx talks about the machine, he describes these scenes of workers taking up hammers and destroying machines because as the machines arrive, they literally take away jobs. So he describes these moments of revolt where the humans pick up hammers and try and destroy the machines. Well, in a sense, there's a similar story going on with animal agriculture in that there's a direct antagonism going on between the machine and animals. And in a sense, I think there's a different story to tell about the importance of resistance for thinking about animal production. So there's been lots of work in animal studies on animal resistance recently. And my book tries to offer a perspective on resistance that ties with capitalist production. Typically, animal agriculture and fisheries aim to put down animal resistance in order to increase productivity. So typically, the way that the machine works is to overcome the resistance of the animal in order to produce an end product. And we see this directly in industrial fisheries. So if we think about industrial fisheries, they're basically forms of mechanized hunting. And the aim of an industrial fishery is to chase down fish, to quell their own resistance to being caught, and through that process of quelling that resistance, to convert those beings from living beings to saleable commodities. One thing I'd note about this is that if we look at animal production processes and the continual resistance of animals during these production processes, one way to describe animal resistance, is that it's often directly equivalent to animal labor time. So the time that the animal spends laboring is actually equivalent to the time that they spend resisting, which is also the value-producing activity. It's by the process of the machine attempting to quell their resistance that this process then becomes a productive activity that produces the end product. So we think about industrial fishing, the fish are swimming along, minding their own business. Then the trawler comes, it subjects the fish to a fight to the death. And it is this so-called productive activity that produces something that is valuable. And the labor, as you might describe it, of the animals is literally equivalent to their resistance time. So I think there's something interesting for me in thinking about the centrality of resistance to labor. And this builds on some Marxist theory, particularly the work of the Italian Marxists in the 70s, such as Antonio Negri and Mario Tronti, who make this argument that central to all work, like they're talking about human work, is the resistance of workers to that work. And in a sense, I'm quite influenced by this as well. So I want to finally think about, well, what does this mean about the factory farm? What is the factory farm? In some respects, my book makes an argument that all of this gives us a way to understand the factory farm in a very precise way. The factory farm represents, firstly, a trajectory. So it's not a fixed place. It is an ongoing trajectory or dream within capitalism. It's one that seeks to reduce, and in some cases, completely eliminate human labor time. Right? So the most efficient factory farm processes look like humans aren't involved. And of course, I want to stress that, of course, humans are typically involved in aspects of the factory farm, but some of the most diabolical and efficient forms of factory farming have completely removed humans from the scene in production. Secondly, the factory farm represents the massive expansion of animal lives in the form of animal labor. And this can only happen through force breeding. So you have to force breed these animals who will then arrive at production as a mass of raw materials and a simultaneous massive animal labor who will be required to work on themselves to produce an end product. You'll also need a massive expansion of circulating capital, food, water, pharmaceuticals to keep this animal labor force alive. And finally, you'll need a massive deployment of fixed capital. So you'll need a deployment of fixed capital that aims to constrain and dominate animals in order to ensure the compliance of this labor force to produce the end commodity. In a sense, what I've described is what the factory farm is. It is this meeting point of these trajectories, the reduction of human labor time, the expansion of animals, the expansion of circulating commodities, and the expansion of fixed capital. Importantly, I think for animal studies, the book, I hope, offers something of a different perspective on what we should be understanding. So lots of animal studies and post-humanities work is really interested in human-animal relations. They're interested in the entanglement and relationality between humans and animals. But I think what my book shows is that if we think about animal agriculture, where most of the world's animals are in direct contact with humans, then it isn't about a human-animal relationality. It's actually about a direct confrontation between animals and fixed capital. So in a sense, actually, we're dealing with a brutal confrontation between machines, enclosures, and technologies and animal life. And if we think about it, that's of course what the factory farm is, right? If we conjure the image of what a factory farm is, we're typically thinking about the confrontation between fixed capital and animal life. And to me, this tells us something about the neglect of human-animal studies to even understand this relation, that actually we're dealing with this relation between animals and fixed capital. And this relation is, in a sense, what mediates our relation with animals themselves. I would argue that against the kind of celebratory readings of human-animal or relations between animals and technologies that we see in some post-humanist literature, such as Rosi Braidotti. In a sense, actually, there's nothing romantic about these. These are largely antagonistic, or I would say warlike relations between animals and fixed capital. That's what the factory farm effectively is. But I wanted to just finally end by just saying, to coming back to the problem I described at the beginning of the talk, which is that a lot of the focus within animal rights literature has been actually on the experience of the global north. So lots of animal rights literature is focused on the factory farm as it's been developed and forms of vertical integration that have happened in North America, in particular the United States. And this has actually neglected most of the world, the experience of most of the world. And I think actually focusing outside of the rest of the world is really important. One reason is that some of the largest producers of animals globally are not North America, of course. So the largest producer of milk is India. The largest producer of pork or pig production is China, right? So, and the largest largest agriculture nation is China, right? So in a sense, to me, actually, what is happening globally with the globalization of animal agriculture, but also the tendency towards intensification that we're seeing outside of the global north, tells us where animal agriculture is going. One example would be the forms of intensification, the novel forms of intensification that we're seeing in China. So I talked about aquaculture, but you'll be familiar of this development in Hubei province of the so-called skyscraper pig farm that captured a lot of global press. But I'm also interested in the very unique ways that we see production happening in the global south that differ from the vertically integrated models in the US. So one example is in China, a significant proportion of pork production involves backyard production. And this is often tied to forms of industrial production, such as industrial breeding and industrial slaughter, that is interconnected with backyard forms of or low intensity forms of production. So to me, there's a lot of work to do to just understand what is happening for animals outside of the United States. And to me, there's a lot of work to be done in that space. And to me, that's also where lots of the advocacy has to happen, where we need to move beyond the kind of North American focused models of what is happening in animal agriculture. Okay, I've talked for a long time, so maybe I'm going to pause there for questions and thoughts. I'll stop my share now.